We've discussed the depths of Arthur's loyalty and Dutch's betrayal to the ones he supposedly loved most, the gang he considered family once upon a time. We've talked about Hosea seeing Dutch's descent into madness long before it ever actually happened, and we even touched on the exact moment John can be seen beginning to have doubts about Dutch and even Hosea's leadership. But today I wanted to tackle a deeper topic behind it. It's one that'll be covering the ending of both Red Dead Redemption games and some very important reasons as to why John is pushed to go after his former brothers in arms in the first game. So if you haven't completed both games or you don't want anything spoiled for you, I suggest maybe returning back to this video later. But for the rest of you, let's reevaluate John and Dutch's relationship and see if John would ever have actually pulled the trigger on his adopted father.
It's Dutch playing his games. Hosea too. Getting involved with those two families. Master con men working their magic.
I think it's best to begin at the moment where tension between John, Dutch, and Hosea began. That was when Jack was kidnapped by the Braithwaite family as retaliation for the gang's efforts of tricking them. The kidnapping of Jack would trigger a deep regret within John. He would begin to feel responsible for what he could only imagine was a terrible fate waiting for the poor helpless child. In John's eyes, Jack was being punished for his father's poor life choices. Life choices that went as far as disowning Jack as his own son and refusing to make his marriage to Abigail official. John's doubt, worry, and lack of preparation as a father would be projected onto the poor boy and his mother, and this was something that was apparent for everyone to see. Eventually, this would all culminate with John leaving the gang for roughly a year. Even when he did return, he wasn't fully present or willing to outright claim Jack as his son. John would continue to go down this back and forth path of being dedicated as a family man to then switch his focus from his new family to his commitment to the LInde gang. And that's a fence he would stay apprehensively on the top of until the kidnapping of Jack. Not only would it trigger John's dedication to his family, putting them as his priority rather than the LInde gang, but this pivotal moment would give birth to what I believe is a real start to Dutch's detachment from John. That is to say, if Dutch really forgave John for leaving for that year-long hiatus that he took, and he never actually held a grudge like Arthur did. Since there's no real evidence on that actually being the case, I think it's safe to say Jack's kidnapping would be the moment where the relationship between these two would genuinely begin to fracture. As John began to vent to Arthur about his misconduct as a father, he would also begin to voice complaints about Hosea and Dutch, blaming their miscalculation about the Braithwaite and Gray family feuds and creating more of a problem for the gang with little if anything to show for it all. This would of course all be expressed by John to Arthur in private on their way to Shady Belle to relocate the gang from Clemens Point. In this isolated moment between Arthur and John, it just comes off as frustration and remorse of the fate that Jack has to now suffer through, which is understandable, but this is a mind state John would never be able to fully get out of, which is also something Arthur's very quick to warn John about. Once he heads down that rabbit hole and continues to question and look deeper into Dutch and Hosea's actions, perceiving everything they do and everything they say through this negative filter, he'll never fully get out of it. By the time the gang sets out to rob the Saint-Denis bank, John begins to become bolder with his dissatisfaction of Dutch's leadership and plead to do just one more job. He would publicly question Dutch and criticize what his final goal is and whether if he's actually capable of achieving that goal without more unfortunate circumstances befalling the rest of the LInde gang.
This is it, gentlemen. The last one.
Where have we heard that before?
What has happened to you, John? You lost all your heart.
I'm just trying to stay real about all this.
Real? Oh, how I detest that word. So devoid of imagination.
Sure, it comes off disrespectful and a little confrontational. Perhaps it's still some of John's own personal dissatisfaction and remorse being projected with some real concerns mixed in that undoubtedly must be laying heavy on everyone's minds. Had this been a situation in public display of doubt at a much earlier point of the game, maybe Dutch wouldn't have taken it so personal, perceiving John as openly betraying him. But the entire chapter is Saint-Denis riddled with Dutch being a different person. The killing of Angela Bronte was seemingly uncharacteristically brutal of him to do, and it was only going to get worse with the death of Hosea moments after John questioning him. By the time the gang members returned from their hellish vacation on Gorma, it was clear Dutch had made up his mind about his former adopted son. Whether if he came to the conclusion by himself or was gently pushed in the direction of believing John or Abigail, or possibly both, were responsible for the failure of the Saint-Denis bank robbery, it was clear saving John from Cisco was not really a priority of his, at least not at the top of it. When John did return back to camp at Beaver Hollow, Dutch's less than warm welcoming would further deepen a rift between the two of them, a rift that John had inadvertently created by openly questioning Dutch. As the chapter of Beaver Hollow continued, we'll see Dutch continue to distance himself from both John and Arthur, with it eventually culminating in him claiming John was shot and killed during the gang's final robbery on the train carrying the army's payroll. John would be left behind again by his former father and leader, disguising this betrayal as a mistake. Now, he didn't know that John had actually survived. During the final confrontation between Arthur and Micah, what's never really pointed out is during this reveal, John was visibly hurt by his father's actions. Before, there was enough benefit of the doubt, but here, it was just too much.
Dutch!
John?
You left me! You left me to die!
My boy, I didn't have a choice. John, I didn't have a choice.
Left me!
The pain, anger, and confusion all visibly affected John deeply. Dutch made no actual attempt to save him. He just left him on the side of the train tracks, claiming that he did all he could. Interestingly, despite everything John suspected Dutch of doing, from allowing him to get captured in Saint Denis, being okay with leaving him to rot in Cynic Penitentiary, and even slowly letting Micah replace him and Arthur as Dutch's favorite, John still felt his sense of loyalty to Dutch. I mean, it took Arthur twice, both during very pressing times, to give John the talk he needed to hear, to be loyal to what matters. Take your family and get lost. The thing about John's character throughout all of Red Dead Redemption 2 is he comes off as very indecisive. His priorities became realigned after Jack's kidnapping, switching from the Van der Linde gang to his family, but the commitment to just leave with them is never acted upon until it's forced onto him. To be fair, he really doesn't have a choice. He is wanted by the law the same as they all are, but Dutch, this gang, it's all he's ever known. I'm not saying John had a weak character or wasn't capable of doing whatever was necessary. More so, it's difficult to break the patterns and habits you've been accustomed to your whole life. Even during the game's epilogue, years after running with the gang, Abigail's on John's case for being a brutal outlaw just like before. And just as it's difficult to break a way of thinking, reacting, and living as you've done your entire life, it's not as easy to just condemn the man who raised you, who taught you how to read, write, and carry yourself. Dutch was the person who did more for these people at vulnerable times in their life than anybody else ever did. Many of them, he took them in when they were children, John being one of them. And no matter how much Dutch has lost his way and turned his back on them, those early years can't be undone. The epilogue of Red Dead Redemption 2 would be filled with little word on Dutch. It's more so the characters that do remain, Charles, Sadie, and John, reflecting on what the hell happened during the later stages of the Van der Linde gang. If Dutch really lost his mind, if he had gone crazy, if he'd gone sick, was Micah really responsible for everything? And while there's small moments here and there of Sadie, Charles, and John talking about what would happen or what they would do if they ever came into contact with Micah, there's only one conversation where John actually addresses what he thought about Dutch.
You heard anything of Dutch?
Nothing. You?
No. You'd think. He's a colorful character. Word would get out.
That's one way of putting it. Look, what happened with the gang changed everyone who was a part of it. The Dutch who put a blanket round me after the O'Driscolls, that weren't the same man at Beaver Hollow. And now, he might not be so colorful no more.
You see a man whose character changed. I see a man who got found out for who he truly was. We was fools to follow him. I was a fool and I paid for it. And I was one of the lucky ones.
Micah, John. Micah's the one who set it off.
I blame me for following Dutch for too long, but I blame Micah for most everything else.
There's no word on anyone looking for Dutch or what happened to him beyond just a little bit of curiosity. If there's anyone they feel deserves to receive a visit from them, it's Micah. Sadie steers the conversation to remind John Micah's responsible for everything. Dutch may have left John twice and chose his side back at Beaver Hollow, but it was Micah who's going to get what's coming to him. That's the mentality of Charles, Sadie, and John. When the trio catch wind of Micah camping out on top of Mount Hagen, they went for a blood payment, and it was Micah's to fulfill. Dutch's presence was wholly unexpected.
Hello, son. Mrs. Adler. It's been quite a while.
The two of them would have words on betraying and shooting at each other, and it would end with Dutch turning on Micah, glaring at John as he walked by his son, who would only be able to muster the phrase, "thank you." Regardless of everything that happened, I think John in this game spoke about Dutch from a perspective of both pain and confusion. Regardless of his apparent frustration, he wasn't willing to turn the trigger on Dutch. The situation between these two, and those that did remain in the area, would be drastically different some years later.
Where's Dutch, Marston?
He got away.
Scared to shoot him? Too much to handle?
The year's 1911. John hasn't seen Dutch in at least a solid 3 years. Their last interaction was in 1907 on top of Mount Hagen. Despite not seeing Dutch in almost half a decade or running with the gang of outlaws in a full decade, John is forced by the Bureau of Investigation to deal with Bill Williamson, who's causing trouble in the region of New Austin. Bill would eventually flee the country to the region of Nuevo Paraíso out in Mexico, placing Javier Escuela on John's hit list as well. Now during this game, John is much older, much more cutthroat than he was in the years before. His family and the life he worked so hard with his wife Abigail was all forced to be put on hold by the Bureau, who are holding his wife and son as captives until he does their bidding, and that is bringing down the people he used to ride with, which for simplicity's sake is Bill Williamson, Javier Escuela, and then towards the end of the game, it's rumored Dutch is back in the region of Blackwater. Now during this game, John is very much a morally gray character, but it's quite obvious he's still willing to do whatever it takes to get his family back. That's still his bottom line. While he does what the Bureau asks of him, he also clearly very much hates every part of it. Now originally he would attempt to take the path of least resistance and reason with Bill to quietly give himself up. Instead of going guns blazing, there's an exchange between the two of them that betrays a little sympathy for the people John used to know so well. And of course he couldn't be bothered with falling into this line of work or dealing with people wrapped up in this lifestyle he has renounced so many years ago. But for those of us that have played this game, we know John would end up being shot here, sparking the series of events that end up with the death of Bill and the incarceration or killing of Javier. Javier is the only character that the player can decide lives or dies by John's hand. But when it comes to Dutch, the situation is much more complicated. With Bill and Javier, there would be an exchange and of course some type of a reunion, but there's no mistake, John is after them, and his life has sent him down an entirely different path. It's also important to note that whenever John has this exchange with both Bill and Javier, the only people that could potentially get hurt are those on either side. They're either lawmen, they're outlaws, or they're in the middle of the war going on in Mexico. When Dutch is introduced, he's in the middle of a bank robbery, a fairly violent one in the center of Blackwater, and he's holding a civilian woman at gunpoint. Similar to Bill and Javier, this is the first time Dutch and John will see each other in some years, so there is some level of reunion. Dutch would question him how his son and of course Abigail is doing and how John is, but it's still a very intense reunion, if we can call it that. Dutch is inching closer to the exit with a woman at gunpoint, and during this interaction, Dutch would also begin to insult John, talking about how he married a whore and everybody had Abigail at one point in time, but John married her. So that makes him the better man. Dutch would say John was always the romantic sort and he can have the girl. It's a parting gift from Dutch to John.
We all had her. Oh, but he married her. And you know that makes him a better man than us. He's a better man. Have the girl, John.
Easy, Dutch.
She's a parting gift from me.
Oh! God damn!
John and the sheriffs from Blackwater would pursue Dutch and his new gang, but Dutch would end up getting away. Edgar Ross would then question John's ability and willingness to put Dutch down, to which John rebuttals when the opportunity presents itself. He'll put a bullet in him. He won't like himself for doing it, but he'll get it done. As an isolated incident, disregarding the knowledge we have from Red Dead Redemption 2 on where Dutch and John last left off, it's a compelling reunion. This entire time, there's rumors of Dutch being in the area and recruiting natives as well as any outlaws in the area willing to rally behind Dutch's leadership. Just scraping together the bottom of the barrel, a far cry in terms of the quality of arms Dutch once had at his disposal. For his first time exposure to Dutch, especially after hearing John talk so highly of him throughout the game and the moments where he does bring Dutch up, until the end where he went crazy and left him to die. It's an introduction for a man who was built up so much that I think pays off. But knowing how the last time they saw each other went and witnessing Dutch's descent down a path of anger and narcissism and using anyone he could as collateral, this moment here within the bank perfectly displays just how far Dutch went in that direction. Even when he spoke to John on Mount Hagen, he still had an air of doubt to him. that just maybe he can still be somewhat redeemed. Here he spoke warmly to John, calling him son, positioning himself where you can't quite tell where he stands between Micah and John. And with the whole narrative in that game as Dutch went downhill, it was almost as if you were dealing with two different people when it came to Dutch, and those that did follow him couldn't tell whether if he lost his way or if this is the person that he's always been. The only way to really betray that he's kind of lost his way and he's not the man that he was before is that he's visibly unkempt. He grew a beard, his hands are dirty, he's not as clean cut as before, even if he's as charismatic and eloquent as ever. Here in the bank, the uneasiness and unpredictability factor is still present as it was on Mount Hagen. However, there's almost no hope for any good outcome. John is now hunting him, and Dutch, well, he's become accustomed to enjoying the life of a cold-blooded killer. John would make an offer for Dutch to surrender without a fight as he does with Javier and Bill, but this would just result in the death of a poor girl and John being accused of being afraid of putting Dutch down. The thing about the bank encounter is that, sure, we can say it wasn't John's fault. He tried to rationalize with a man who gave him so much and it backfired. Despite their past, here's still an olive branch. For narrative reasons, or even if we go down the route of deepening John as a character and say he was overwhelmed with so much emotion at seeing Dutch for the first time after so many years. Dutch had already inspired mixed emotions, but now with his family at stake and hating the side that he was fighting for, basically forcing him to come to face Dutch yet again, a man that he sworn off many years ago as he's done to him. Whatever the reason for Dutch's escape here, after this the tables will turn. Dutch would appear in Blackwater, shooting out the window of the hotel John's at, telling him he's going to kill John purely for the sport of it. A few days later, John would track down the location of Dutch's camp out on tall trees, where Dutch would shoot at him, narrowly missing and hitting the binoculars John was looking through. And Dutch's actions, supported by his attitude towards John in Red Dead Redemption 2, might have betrayed John was out of his good graces, caring less and less for what happened to his former son as long as it doesn't involve him being brought down with him. Now in this game, it's evident Dutch is an actual threat. Bill and Javier may have made it difficult for John to track them down, and John of course would meet some fierce resistance at times, but neither one of them had the audacity to chase after John personally, nor do it in a way that was so nonchalant.
You and your friend there, the professor, we're gonna kill the both of you.
Why you want to do a thing like that?
I don't know. Sport, I guess.
John had every reason, multiple instances across both games, that there would only be one way this would end between the two of them. One of them would end up in a body bag. Yet even in the final moments to do what he had to do, after being left for dead, abandoned multiple times, willing to be hanged and shot at by Dutch a handful of times, in the final moments he would hesitate, offering Dutch one final chance to just surrender.
I can't fight my own nature. That's a paradox, John. You see?
Then I have to shoot you.
As John stood over the lifeless body of Dutch, Edgar Ross would come over and mock him about his inability to kill the infamous Dutch Vanderlyn. John would respond by saying, "Why does it matter? The man's dead. It's the end of an era." Despite giving John multiple reasons to further justify putting him down, from his family being at stake to everything Dutch has done to him. I mean, even when it came to Bill and Javier, as well as Dutch, seeing the safe return of his family, going back to the life he has subscribed himself to for the last few years, and redeeming himself in the eyes of the society he hated so much in his youth, was noble of enough reason as you can get to do what he's forced to do. Of course, he was raised and lived by a code of honor and loyalty, and that dictated how he moved and carried himself a lifetime ago, and perhaps it was one deep down that he still struggled to go against, as he brings up how they left him for dead years ago as added justification for what he's doing now, as if to justify it himself further that it's okay to put these men down. When he does talk about being left for dead, when it comes to Bill and Javier, he does talk as if the blame and responsibility for what happened to him is put on the shoulders of Dutch. He was the leader after all, but when it comes to Dutch, he's not as willing to put him down as he was with Bill or Javier. On the final ride up to Dutch's camp, with the army and bureau agents taking part in the raid to see to it that Dutch is finally brought down, John expresses that Dutch is a better, more honest man than all of them. He was a good man once upon a time who did more good for the poor than the government ever did, and at least Dutch would shoot people in the front, not from behind like these civilized people the agents claim to be. All the way into the very end, Dutch is still the lesser of two evils in John's eyes. He never really held a grudge or sought out vengeance for anything or everything Dutch ever did to him or was expected of doing to him. One of the last few words John says to Dutch is he has to shoot him, and that's in response to Dutch saying he can't give up, fighting is in his nature. From Mount Hagen, the time in the bank, and now here, John certainly had opportunities to deal with Dutch on his own terms. If it wasn't for him being forced, he would have never come looking for Dutch. If he never settled into an honest life, finally committed himself to his wife and son as he should have done long before, he obviously would not be put in this position. Despite the position that he's in, along with everything he's been put through, killing Dutch was never on the table. I don't think it would have been. Even if Dutch was to pull out the revolver and open fire on John, and John was to shoot him, I don't think it would have been a fatal shot. It definitely would have been enough to apprehend him, but not enough to kill him. In his own way, in a way that allowed him to still be committed to his family, do right by them, to settle into an honest, safe life, he was still loyal to Dutch. Only now the loyalty was giving him another chance at a new life. How much of a life that really was, rotting in jail or being hung by his neck for everything he's done throughout his life, that's debatable. At least he wasn't the one putting him down. Dutch killing himself in the end worked out for everyone. It helped John avoid something he never wanted to do, something he probably, as he said, would come to hate himself more for, potentially being the thing that he hated himself most for. It would also help Dutch go down on his own terms. In the end, it's ironic how Dutch's perceived betrayal by John pushed him down his own path that saw him break off from Dutch, but didn't see the depth of the love for the man who raised him, even when that man was shooting at him and giving him every reason in the book to make everything easier for him.